Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, Modernizing High-Resolution Land Use and Land Cover Data for Coastal State Resilience. My name is Emily Reitz. I'm the Technology Director at the National States Geographic Information Council. If you're unfamiliar with our organization, NSGIC exists to advance effective national coordination of geospatial information by supporting state-level cooperation. Say that 5 times fast. We serve as a national forum for the development of capable and future-oriented geospatial leadership. If you'd like more information on how to get involved with NSGIC or just more information about us in general, please visit our website, www.nsgic.org. Just a couple housekeeping things right off the bat. All attendees have been muted on entrance, and there'll be some time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please place those into the chat box, as well as who the question is for, because we have quite a number of presenters on today. And so we'll take a look at those at the end of the presentation. A recorded version of this webinar will be made available afterwards, and that will go out in an email, hopefully by the end of the week. So with that, I will turn it over to Brandon Palin from Ecopia. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Let me just get set up here. So thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, NSGIC, for helping us host this meeting with all like-minded folks. As Emily said, my name is Brandon Palin. I'm the Senior Director for Public Sector at Ecopia AI. I believe most of you are familiar with us, especially given the scope of us sponsoring this webinar. But as a brief introduction, Ecopia is a geospatial data services company that focuses on leveraging artificial intelligence to extract features from our Earth. Altogether, though, this webinar is really not just about us. This webinar is to bring perspective from federal, state, and private sector on the value of high-resolution land cover data. I'm not going to provide too many introductions for our presenters as we go through this. That you can see on the list, we have a few people joining us from the state of North Carolina, South Carolina, and NOAA. So rest assured, you are definitely in good hands with some very intellectually smart people. And I hope that we have a very engaging discussion. And whatever audience you're coming from today, I hope that you can at least take something away from this, whether it's how people are using data, whether it's how they're going about getting funding, or ultimately one thing that I think is most important is the value of geospatial data today. So before I hand it over to Nate, I want to leave you guys with a thought to think about as we kind of go through this conversation. As we continue to enter the market of whether it's new technology, buzz topics coming out, especially with prevalence of artificial intelligence becoming more mainstream through services like ChatGPT, the concept of a digital twin is becoming what I would say more prevalent. It's becoming more of the forefront to what people are talking about today. Now, what I want to say to that intent, though, is that geospatial data is the root of innovation in terms of these developments. Or as I like to say, the geospatial data is the foundation of innovation. And in this case, what I like to further say is that geospatial data is the tool for building more resilient communities. And I'm really thankful to be joined by these three respective groups today that will be able to highlight just how they're leveraging geospatial data products to instill this mission, and more importantly, how they're taking advantage of higher resolution products that have ever been accessible before. So with that, I'll pass it over to Nate Harold from NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, and he can dive right into things.
Thanks, Brandon. So as Brandon said, my name's Nate Harold. I'm a physical scientist with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. I lead up our coastal change analysis program. That's NOAA's authoritative source for land cover mapping and monitoring. My goal here and my role in this presentation is to provide you a little bit of context in terms of history involved in land cover mapping and what NOAA's role is in this work. So I mentioned CCAP, an authoritative source. We are recognized as what's called a national geospatial data asset, and we've been producing these products for a number of years, decades. We've worked historically with the USGS and every other federal agency who does similar production work at the national scale through the Multi-Resolution Land Characteristics Consortium. That's a mouthful, I know. But essentially, a lot of the history of our program has been focused on mapping from Landsat imagery and then monitoring the changes by updating those products every 5 years. Right now, we're in the process of producing one last update for the year 2021. We expect to have that done by the end of this calendar year, but that is expected to be our last update at that resolution. And that's because NOAA has been turning our attention and our future direction into producing higher resolution versions of those land cover products. Data that could be used at the county and municipal level for local and site-specific management and decision-making. The types of decision-making that 30-meter data could not support in the past. Now, high-resolution data isn't something new for NOAA, but it's been historically pretty expensive for us to produce and therefore pretty limited in terms of the amount of area where we could produce it. Really what we've seen is as more free and low-cost data has become available, processing power has really increased, and there's been pretty huge advances in terms of technology, things like deep learning AI that you'll hear more about from Brandon. It really has made the production of that type of data faster, cheaper, and better. And I'm going to put a huge caveat on that. When I say faster does not mean fast, cheaper does not mean cheap, and better does not mean perfect, right? There's an old saying, fast, cheap, and good, pick two. And really what we've focused in on is the fact that fast and cheap can sound good, but the resulting data might not really be fit for the intended use. I think most people are pretty familiar with the old idiom, garbage in equals garbage out. And really what NOAA's kind of focused on is trying to get to a long-term goal where we're producing high quality products at this better resolution for that local use. Our end goal is to make this transition starting in that 2021 timeframe, and then to keep those products up to date going forward into the future on roughly a 4 to 6 year update cycle. And this will be a replacement for the 30-meter products that we've produced in the past, where those coarser level products might become more of a historic change or trend analysis, and the higher resolution data really provides us a step towards taking that in the future direction. We've already started to take our first steps. Many of you have been in past NSGIC meetings and have heard me give some updates on this work. Back in January of this year, we released essentially the first initial series of our data products that we developed in partnership with Ecopia. The initial short-term focus on those data has been focused in on impervious surfaces, woody vegetation, both shrubs and trees, and water feature extractions. Brandon, you can go back to the map slide there. These are the areas that we have those data sets already available. If you come to our high-res CCAP page within the Digital Coast, you can access either the services or the data directly. The area covers about 1.5 million square miles. That's over 3 trillion pixels, and it includes the entire state of Alaska. We're coordinating our efforts with the Chesapeake Bay program and the Chesapeake Conservancy that are doing similar work in that region of the country. And we've been able to expand upon this extent here to pick up a couple of full state regions. NOAA has been able to fund the development of those same impervious canopy and water data sets for the full state of Wisconsin, Louisiana, and South Carolina, which will play into some of the work that we talk about in a few minutes. And we've worked with some of the other states like Washington to expand that coverage to their full state as well. I think, this data here provides us kind of the starting point for where we want to go as a further step. Because as great as we hope you'll find this impervious canopy and water data, and as useful as I think you'll see them to be as you download them, it's not our end goal, right? It's only our first step. We expect to build upon the foundation that those data sets provide us and add in all of the additional categories that CCAP typically maps as part of our land cover product line. If you go forward into the next slide, Brandon, you can see those categories. We map about 20 different land cover types. You can see a lot of the upland categories listed on the left-hand side of your slide, the wetland categories listed on the right-hand side of your slide. Of particular note I'll make is that these are very consistent with the data sets and the classifications that we've had for our 30-meter products in the past, with some slight changes due to the resolution differences. They're also very similar to the types of data sets that you would see in the Fish and Wildlife Service's National Wetland Inventory. It's not exactly the same, but CCAP serves as kind of an NWI light. We've done a lot of work with the Fish and Wildlife Service and folks like the USGS with their 3D HP program to start to see if the production of these data sets could start to be a little bit more coordinated and help play into the updates of the others, saving everyone some time and money. And essentially my last slide here, I'm just going to close with the latest in terms of status of where we've produced these products, the full scheme products, that is. You can see a couple of areas highlighted in green. Tampa, Florida is one that we've had out for a number of months. That was our earliest pilot geography. We just recently released the Houston-Galveston area that you can see highlighted there. That's about an 11-county area. And then we're going to be working our way through a lot of the other geographies that are highlighted in the darker blue colors. Those are either areas that we have already under development or that we have tentatively planned out for development later in this fiscal year and going into FY25. Other than that, the rest of the country is kind of an open slate for us. And we're hoping that some of the discussions that we have and the project work that we have as an example in North Carolina and South Carolina might interest others on this telephone call to reach out and talk to us about what might be possible for your geography.
Thank you very much, Nate. I appreciate the background and the update in terms of the NOAA CCAP program. And for everyone here, if you haven't guessed the theme of this yet, it's about the concept of data partnership. So what we're trying to articulate with the message today is the identity that historically data products, especially geospatial solutions, have been created in a very siloed fashion. There's been coordination, perhaps some coordination at the federal level, but not a lot of working relationships, especially in terms of alignment with state and even local government. And ultimately, with the transition to higher resolution products and the feasibility of creating those products in a way that, as Nate put it, faster, cheaper, and better comes into play, it's affording a new opportunity. So next up, we're going to have Andrew White come in here from South Carolina, the South Carolina Office of Resilience, and talk to you guys a little bit more about the work that they're doing right now and the coordination that's ongoing, not just at a state level, but also with NOAA and the feds. So Andrew, you want to come in?
Sure. Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Nate. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew White. I've been with the Office of Resilience since 2020, which is when SCORE was created. Previously, and I'm just giving some background on what SCORE is and why we would be interested in a high-resolution land cover product. I'll go into how our recommendations kind of pointed towards this and how we tried to fund it before I let you know exactly what we're trying to get out of it as well. So for some background, SCORE was created in 2020. It is a cabinet level agency, but it did exist beforehand as the Disaster Recovery Office. So it was addressing disaster recovery from storms in 2015, 2016, and 2018. We did pivot in 2020 and we added kind of resilience planning to our scope, and we did publish the first strategic statewide resilience and risk reduction plan in July of 2023. That QR code to the right is just to our homepage, so if you want to go look at our plan or our other programs, you feel free. We are led by a Chief Resilience Officer, Ben Duncan, and the resilience planning team that tackled that first resilience plan was a planning director, Alex Butler, who's a hydrologist by training. We have a state planner, we have a GIS analyst, that's me. We have a second hydrologist who served as our staff scientist. That resilience planning process was stakeholder driven. I think we had over 120 different voices, from local communities to counties to nonprofits to corporate partners. And just because of the 2-year planning horizon that we were given, it is flood focused, but I want to clarify that we are all hazards relevant. I should also clarify that we are not an emergency management agency. We work closely with our South Carolina Emergency Management Division, but as soon as that hurricane is on the radar, we're going to step back and let them do their jobs, and we're going to wait for after the event to analyze how things went and plan for the future again and do the housing recovery that we've been so good at. Our planning process did target past, current, and future conditions as much as data allowed, and the last chapter of that plan was 56 actionable recommendations, 19 of which were on data collection. I have that map at the bottom right there to show just how much this office likes high resolution data. So we did end up using the First Street Foundation's 3-meter flood data. So that map is of Columbia, South Carolina, and kind of overlays the FEMA flood maps with the First Street data. And it really helped communities understand where flooding happens, because they can kind of point to those communities, those areas inside their neighborhoods where they're seeing flooding and they're being impacted by it. So this office is huge on big data, on good data. Slide, please. There we go. I won't read the whole recommendation to you, but this is a direct recommendation from our resilience plan. That QR code is to our recommendations chapter. So if you want to go read 40 pages, I implore you to. But our need for land cover data was born out of our reliance on the National Land Cover Dataset for our regional analysis. We made a few different products based on it, including our conservation priorities, which helped us weed out those already developed areas, those open water areas, and those wetland areas. But it also was able to be combined with soils data to pick out those areas where there is the potential for stormwater infiltration instead of runoff. So ideally, we are protecting all those areas that are both flood prone and also important for stormwater infiltration. And so we can mitigate flood risk by conserving our land appropriately. We also use the National Land Cover Dataset to do land cover change analysis. So we were able to go back to around 2000 and show which watersheds and counties were changing the most. We have a ton of development in South Carolina along the coast and on the I-85 corridor, and also with our neighbors to the north, North Carolina. Last thing I want to say is that we know this National Land Cover Dataset is inappropriate for the community scale, and that's important for us because the next step in our planning process is downscaling all of our planning to watersheds. We have 8 major watersheds in South Carolina, and we're in the process of putting a watershed coordinator in each of them so that we can form cross-jurisdictional planning partnerships, and people can understand how their actions and developments are going to impact those downstream, as well as understand how you're going to be impacted by those who are upstream of you. Slide, please. As for funding, we did ask for some feedback from our state partners, and they were pretty keen on the idea of high resolution land cover. So we had people who are really interested in environmental impact assessments, figuring out how a commercial development is going to impact the environment, or how widening a highway is going to impact it similarly. We had other groups that were interested in, like Nate talked about, supplementing the National Wetlands Inventory, especially in the post-Sackett era. So as we go about making sure that we're monitoring and assessing our own wetlands, we think this is going to be a really valuable tool, and that's why we had some buy-in from state partners. As I'm sure everyone on this call can commiserate with, the state budgeting process can make coordinating efforts for a data product like this harder in the short run. So SCORE did end up funding this internally with our reserve fund. That's a fund that was capitalized when our office was formed. It is at the discretion of the Chief Resilience Officer. So we can either spend that money on post-disaster activities to try to shorten timelines with associated with recovery, or we can spend that money on sunny day things like data acquisition. So that's what we're using for this. We were reimbursed for 30% of that. All good. We were reimbursed for 30% of that by our climate pollution reduction grant. That's an EPA grant planning opportunity, and I'll get into why we're using that funding opportunity. Slide. So why are we pursuing this? Internally, we had a lot of products leaning on the National Land Cover Dataset that we really want downscaled, and that conservation priority model is just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to be great to really hone that and get into communities and show them how the landscape is important for doing those ecosystem services that we rely on. Second, that carbon estimation on natural and working lands associated with the CPRG grant. We want to know when we're pursuing our opportunities in conservation, exactly what kind of carbon benefits we can be tracking, because that planning grant is to analyze the sources and sinks of carbon in South Carolina. And the National Land Cover data set is great for course analysis, but I think that high resolution land cover is going to be great at showing, how many shrublands or trees are on a property if we're looking at protecting it for carbon benefit. We wouldn't be the Office of Resilience if we didn't talk about some flood intelligence. We do want this data to better inform our flood models. We have a lot of great modeling activities going on in South Carolina, especially in the wake of the storms that we've had in the last decade or so, and we want to make sure that our models are as good and accurate as possible so that communities can be planning appropriately. We also want to make sure that this data is available for those communities that participate in the community rating system with FEMA. They should be able to calculate better open spaces with this data, which hopefully will give them a steep discount in their insurance rates for flood. And lastly, just selfishly, we want to be able to do the best local planning that we can at the watershed level. Externally, we've had those groups talk about environmental impact assessments and wetlands investigations and supplementing the NWI in the post-SACIT era. So those are the known benefits, and I do want to say who knows what the benefits are going to be. This is going to be a public data set. There's been so much good research with the NLCD. I look forward to seeing what all of our state partners and our GIS savvy Carolinians are going to end up doing with this data and seeing what info they can share back to the resilience world. That's my contact info. That's one more QR code to our homepage. I'm happy to field any of your emails that you might have for me. But other than that, I think that does it for South Carolina, and I'll pass it back to Brandon.
Thank you, Andrew. And if everyone hasn't noticed yet, I'm doing my best to scroll through these slides in appropriate coordination. But if you see me going back and forth on one or two slides, that's my apologies. But Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to put this together. I think it's really useful to start identifying and understanding those individual use cases, not to mention also in understanding the priorities of an individual state. So, for example, you guys having the resources within the Office of Resilience to make something like this happen may not be the case for other states. You brought up the challenges of funding, and I think that comes to the table for everyone here, whether you're trying to support it from the private sector or on the public sector, trying to make it happen. And when you work collaboratively across these functions, as we'll see here with North Carolina, there's multiple options out there. And I love how we're diving deeper into that and understanding that there is a utility to this data and there is a way to make it happen. And with that, I'm going to transition this over to our friends in North Carolina, who are going to talk a little bit more about why they jumped on board with higher resolution land cover products, and a little bit more explicitly about that partnership here with NOAA. So once again, no introductions needed for this crew, but Colleen, I'll let you jump in here and get things started for you guys.
Thanks, Brandon. I'm Colleen Kiley. I'm the GIS Coordination Program Manager for North Carolina, and I work within our Center for Geographic Information and Analysis. And Brandon, if you want to go to our first slide, we can get started. To kind of put this in context of where North Carolina has been with land cover, let's start out with the year 1996. Bill Clinton was president, Alanis Morissette was on the radio, and you had to be on your couch at a specific time and day of the week if you wanted to watch ER. So that was the last time North Carolina evaluated its needs and funded land cover data. And since then, we've really relied on NLCD because the North Carolina specific specifications that we put together for 1996 were pretty close to NLCD, and it was free. We didn't have to pay for it ourselves. So I'm going to take you through how we decided to break out of that rut that we've been in for decades and embrace some updated technology for our citizens' land cover needs. So I'll be talking about a bunch of committees, and I want to spend just a moment to talk about how this project fits in with our overall coordination program, which That's under me and my boss, Tim Johnson. So at the top, we have our GICC. It's in North Carolina. That's a statutory body with 35 members. And under that is our statewide mapping advisory committee, also statutory and the main body that coordinates our statewide framework data sets and the primary source for data specifications and business plans for those data sets. So the SMAC has many working groups which make recommendations to the SMAC, which in turn make recommendations to the GICC for adoption. And one of those is the Land Cover Working Group. So stakeholders from local, state, and federal agencies, as well as academia and the private sector, serve on these working groups. But most often it's the agency partners on those groups that take the reins and find funding and work on the project, which is exactly the case for this working group. Next slide. So now that you know the coordination framework, how did we get from 1996 to here? So in 2018, the SMAC tasked the working group to look at ways to update land cover data, including new sources and processes, and report back on whether the NLCD was still adequate. So the working group completed their report in 2019 with some recommendations and requirements, which I'll go over in a minute. And then there was a pause due to the pandemic. But in 2022, the GICC had some outreach meetings across the state to listen to what the GIS community needed. And land cover kept coming up as a need. So we had a detailed discussion after one of our GICC meetings in early 2023. And the end result was a renewal of the working group by the SMAC. And the iteration of the working group that reviewed the 2019 report recommendations, they realized that that was still valid and it still met the user needs. And the 2023 review and recommendations and partners are what I'm going to discuss next. So the 2019 report outlined 15 to 20 use cases for land cover, and these are just a quick summary. I want you to notice how many of these are directly related to water quality and wetlands, and that's going to come into funding. So there's a lot of different needs, but it's really those land cover, the wetland and water quality ones that resulted in funding. Next slide. And the 2019 report outlined 3 priority requirements. They were 1 meter resolution, some specific classifications, and annual updates. Next slide. So the review of 2019 recommendations determined that the recommendations posed then were still valid community needs with the exception of the yearly update. So we pretty much looked at it and said, that's not going to be financially feasible, but the 4 to 6 year update cycle for CCAP definitely was. And this whole time we're sort of moving in the direction of looking at CCAP. And so while we were looking at those needs, there was a group at DEQ focused on wetland mapping. And one of our GICC goals is to reduce duplication of effort. So it really was a natural fit to join forces and bring these 2 groups together towards our common need. And as I mentioned previously, within our coordination framework, it's usually our agency partners that fund and implement the project. So I have 2 of our partners here today, and I'll let them tell you how they made this happen. So I'm going to hand this over to Charlie Deaton with our Division of Marine Fisheries.
Hey, thanks, Colleen. Yeah, I'm Charlie Deaton, a coastal habitat protection biologist with North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality's Division of Marine Fisheries. And so at DMF, our habitat section's guiding document is our Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, which is legislatively mandated by North Carolina's Fisheries Reform Act from 1997, but we update the plan every 5 years. And so while DMF is the home of the CHIP, as we abbreviate the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan to, it's a collaboratively developed document among a lot of North Carolina's state agencies and divisions within DEQ that we use as a comprehensive source to sink approach to coastal habitat protection. And the 2021 CHIP had 5 priority issues that are on the screen here, but our interest in high resolution CCAP mapping was largely motivated by the emphases on wetland protection and habitat monitoring. And those resulted in these recommended actions to pursue funding for 1 meter CCAP mapping and to form an interagency work group that would develop a coastal wetland mapping and monitoring plan. And that group's been really fundamental in funding this work. Next slide. So this is a Google Earth time lapse of the Swan Quarter area in Hyde County, North Carolina. So you'll notice in the red circled area, some marsh loss that's happened over the last 40 years. And that yellow circled area, you'll notice where brackish transitional marshes are migrating landward in response to sea level rise and salinity intrusion, and taking away area from formerly forested wetlands. So because sea level rise is such a major threat to North Carolina's coastal wetlands, we really want to be able to kind of quantify this. But our current mapping resolutions prevent us from meaningfully quantifying these changes at a local level. So Brandon, if you want to advance real quick, should be some text pop up. Sorry, can you advance the slide? There it is, bingo, thank you. But so we're going for 1 meter CCAP mapping will dramatically increase the resolution that we're working with here, from a few hundred pixels to describe these areas that are, several square kilometers each to thousands of pixels. So being able to quantify these will give us a better picture of where our wetlands will and won't be able to migrate landward. And I'm not going to go into many details here, but we're also pursuing funding for some of CCAP's advanced salt marsh mapping products, so that in addition to being able to quantify losses and gains of salt marsh, we'll also be able to get a better understanding of change within salt marshes in response to sea level rise. Next slide. And our interest in better land cover mapping goes beyond just mapping changes in wetland extent. So submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, is an essential fish habitat. And because SAV is a plant, even though it's underwater, it still requires adequate light to grow. But as nutrient pollution and water column chlorophyll have increased in our estuaries, our light availability has decreased, and that's resulted in declines in SAV habitat, in some places up to 80% loss, especially in our low salinity estuarine systems. So the Department of Environmental Quality began implementing water quality rules for the Neuse and Tarp-Pamlico River basin systems, which are pictured here, over 2 decades ago, but we're still seeing increases in chlorophyll and declining water clarity in our estuaries. So our hope is that this increase in resolution of land cover mapping will help us be able to better understand and manage some of the emerging sources of nutrients that have thwarted some of the goals of the Neuse and Tarp-Pamlico basin rules. Next slide. And now I think I'm going to hand it over to Bill, who's going to talk a little bit about our partnership and how we got all of this funded.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. So my name is Bill Kroll. I'm the director of the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership, and we're based in North Carolina, but we're a bi-state program. Brandon, next slide, please. And we're in North Carolina and Virginia, and we cover a number of the watersheds that drain into the Albemarle-Pamlico Sounds. And we're hosted by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. So in working with North Carolina DEQ, and you can go to the next slide, we were looking at better ways to monitor and map our wetlands within APNEP. And then, as Charlie mentioned, North Carolina's Coastal Habitat Protection Plan was also interested in very similar aspects to wetlands that we were interested in. We work collaboratively with implementing the CHIP and our strategic plan called our Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan, or CCMP. And as we were working with folks to get this going, our mapping effort, it grew into a bigger effort. And we had North Carolina DEQ pull together stakeholders to review wetland mapping needs. And from these meetings, we determined that the NOAA CCAP, a high-level resolution product, could provide a significant step forward for us. While the benefit for land cover data hasn't changed over the decade or so, that change in spatial resolution was the biggest step forward, a game changer for us, going from 1 meter to, 30 meter to 1 meter, and the grain size going about a 900 magnification increase is really important, not just for our needs, but a number of our partners. And so in October 2023, APNEP's Leadership Council met and decided we could use funding that we'd received from EPA under a BIL grant, or Bipartisan Infrastructure Law grant, to support increasing the areas in which we were interested in mapping. As Nate showed earlier, North Carolina has some other data that's available for us, and they could do this along with Ecopia. And so moving forward with our initial 2 partners of DEQ, marine fisheries and in APNEP money, we were able to work with other folks. And some of these folks are listed in this working group, but we can go to the next slide. And we were able to piece together, thankfully, because of our partners in South Carolina, being interested in the watersheds that drain into their state. And we were working with folks in the Commonwealth of Virginia as well as some mapping efforts that were occurring there. And so after discussions with Nate and NOAA, we thought we could piece together potential funding. APNEP's based as a partnership, and we're about a quarter of the state, but that left the remaining part. And so we started reaching out to other partners, Fish and Wildlife, Wildlife Resources Commission, our state energy office, and our Office of Resiliency as well, and started piecing together funding to try to get all of the state's watersheds mapped under this process as well. So we can go on to the next slide. So just as a quick overview, we were able to work with marine fisheries for some of the funding. APNEP is for some of the funding. Virginia's DEQ, as I mentioned, is getting some of their area mapped, and we think that NOAA will be able to translate some of their data. Our North Carolina Energy Office is providing some funding, much like South Carolina, for the CPRG planning grant, and we'll have a variety of uses for the wetland information there. And we're working with them and them in the Cape Fear Basin in Western North Carolina as well. We hope to be able to expand our wetland mapping. We're still trying to gather funds for that. So we pulled all together the partners. There's a multitude of needs for this data, and especially at this new resolution. I think some of our partners not even sure quite how they're going to use all of it. Are quite excited to be able to get a much refined view than we've had in the past. So let me go to the next slide. One of the things that's occurred as we were doing all this, our governor took notice of what had happened, and as long as what Andrew had mentioned, also what happened in the Supreme Court with the Sackett decision, and had asked North Carolina to become a little more aware of what our wetlands are and the condition of them. And so an executive order came out in February, just reinforced the efforts that we were working on in our team. And so we're trying to move forward now. We're looking forward to working with South Carolina and NOAA to get this product done. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I'm actually amazed. We're 100% on schedule to within 20 seconds, which is a first for when we have this many people. But that was really a fantastic overview. And I think what's highlighted through this is, ultimately speaking, when it comes to higher resolution land cover products, the real value is driven when you get a conglomerate of groups together and understand that there's more than one use case for a product. And ultimately speaking, land use, land cover data is stemming from the fruition of multiple products. So not everyone's going to need an impervious surface data set. Not everyone's going to need a canopy data set. Not everyone's going to need the full wetland data set. But if you can aggregate those groups together, you can make a systematic solution for your state, or even on a federal scale like we're seeing NOAA do. And to me, that is kind of where I want to jump in. So on Ecopia's standpoint here, first off, I want to thank everyone who presented before me. It's really been a privilege to hear from you guys. And likewise, it's also a privilege to work with you guys in supporting these initiatives here. So my goal is to focus in on data, talk about why it is important, not only to get it, but to get it right. I believe everyone on this call is generally speaking familiar with Ecopia and the work that we're doing as a leading geospatial data provider. So I'm not going to dive too deep into our background and our methodology and how we got to where we're at today. I somewhat feel like the presenters ahead of me gave me just a little bit of credibility for this conversation. So hopefully that guides us through this. But what I am going to focus in on is how these large-scale products that we're developing are benefiting communities. And specifically, I want to dive into how it's benefiting them with their resiliency efforts. So we're going to start off broad and then dive a little bit deeper, because this also follows the same narrative of how Ecopia came to be. So building footprints. Generally speaking, building footprints are one of the most commonly used data sets in GIS. Polygon vectors representing, the spatial extent of a physical structure. Building footprint data provides, important context for base maps, insurance risk assessment, climate resilience analysis, and many other geospatial applications. It's so common that often it's overlooked. And I think this was highlighted most recently and most evidently in the FCC broadband challenges, where it was about understanding where people are in rural communities. And the assumptions were made that we had the data, that we had a fundamental understanding of where communities were, how communities were evolving. And practically speaking, I think most people on this call realize that's just not the case. So why is it important, and why do we maintain these data sets on such a frequent basis? So you can see in front of you, this is actually the representation of building footprints that we extracted over the continental United States, up to about 173 million in our most recent update. But why is that important? So I wanted to dive into a specific example that we worked on. And I know we're focused on coastal communities here. We're joined by the Carolinas, and I will talk about some Carolina stuff, but I also want to talk about Florida. And in this case, what we wanted to look at was some areas that were hit particularly hard during recent hurricanes. And the one I'm going to talk about here is Hurricane Ian, that affected Sarasota County, Florida pretty significantly. And it was unique in that the primary impacts here were the volume of rain and thereby flooding. Generally in hurricanes, most of the damage, yes, obviously you have significant rainfall, significant storm surge, but wind is a primary cause of destruction. So in this case, with all the rain, with the storm kind of sitting above this county, it had a really incremental impact when it came to flooding. Now, what's really deeply concerning is when you start to look at the data and you start to understand how the flood models are developed for these communities, including stuff that stems from the federal side. And when we look at just building footprint databases, let's just look at it from a high level. So Sarasota County, it's not too large in terms of population. We maintain about 225,000 building footprints, compared to 130,000 that are maintained within the OSM database and 198,000 within Microsoft. And as you can see from the header here, what becomes more concerning is how many structures are in the flood zones. And the reason I want to emphasize in this is that data is not always equal. By saying you have a building footprint database, by saying you have a wetland database, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have it right. And Nate alluded to this earlier of the context, and I don't want to necessarily speak poorly on these products because they are strong solutions in their own right and they have a value. But there is that certain extent of when you're doing flood modeling and when you're looking at building the resiliency of communities, you need to understand that things change and things evolve, communities grow. And if you're not maintaining those databases, your models are going to be out of date as well. And so when we quantify this in terms of just measurable property value, the difference between even the highest value in terms of an open source of Microsoft's versus our data in these flood zones is 134 million square feet of data, of property data, versus 122 million square feet of property data. And ultimately, as you can imagine, that translates into some pretty significant value, not to mention even the concerns on life. So understanding exactly where buildings are located is one thing. And I'm not just talking about the location of those structures. It's critical to understand both the natural and built environment. And this is kind of where we're transitioning, or not where we're transitioning, but the evolution of our products have started to be adopted on greater scales. And it forms the narrative of the discussion today. So with classified planimetric level vector features, it's possible to quantify the amount of each land cover type within a given area. We talked about assessing things in a community by community basis in the conversation today, And you need higher resolution products to make that happen, because ultimately this data can be used to understand spatial relationships to power models that predict the impact of natural disasters in coastal communities, in addition to a variety of other initiatives. So I talked about the concept of not all data is equal, and the transition to higher resolution is important, but you also need to understand that higher resolution doesn't necessarily address all your problems. Higher resolution doesn't mean that you can just maintain a status quo. For example, as you transition from a national land cover data set to perhaps, the 1 meter data set that NOAA is pushing, there's a reason why they've transitioned from having just a built up density to having the actual impervious categories. Because as you can see in this example here, this is a 1 meter data set. This would be considered a high resolution data set. But then you compare it to NOAA's recently released data set, excuse me, it's a bit of a mouthful. You can see just the level of detail that is derived when you start to define it more appropriately of what can be picked up at that 1 meter level. Now, part of the value in terms of how we've come into the picture is the fact that we derive this from high resolution aerial. And ultimately, this builds into that narrative of saying, okay, 1 meter is already a great transition from the 30 meter products. I think it was Bill referenced the 900 times magnification. But if you're looking for those property level insights, you need to start talking about the vectors as well. So briefly, I know I want to make sure we leave some time for questions here, but I wanted to do a quick overview of taking into account the data that we've extracted in partnership with NOAA along the coastal areas and what they're doing there. So coastal and flooding events in the US have increased exponentially over the last century. I think we're all pretty familiar with that. Various factors increasing that. We can talk about, increased greenhouse gas emissions, rising temperature, melting ice caps. But I'm not really here to talk about what's causing it. I'm here to talk about what we can do to better understand and prepare. So millions of buildings, roads, and other infrastructure exist in areas that are considered at high risk. There was a recent report that was actually just released last week from the Joint Economic Committee's Democratic staff that estimated the actual cost of flooding in the United States is between 180 and 496 billion each year. That's significantly greater than what previous estimates were. And, you can debate back and forth in terms of, the credibility of these numbers. But ultimately speaking, I think everyone will deduce that it's a problem, and it's a big problem. Now, the component that we wanted to look at, though, is how does data reflect into understanding, vulnerable communities? How do we use data to understand who's most at risk? So according to NOAA, they say 22% of the US coastal population exhibits at least 3 components of social vulnerability. Now, these statistics say something, but they don't paint a picture. So what we did is we started to layer our data sets into this. So we started taking things, for example, we took census block information. We took FEMA's, we took the FEMA risk and vulnerability indexes, and we started to build out maps that enabled us to understand the risk of communities. And when I talk about risk of communities and for flooding, I'm talking about not just understanding, who's within a flood zone, but also understanding the relationship of what could be changed in those communities. And what I mean by that is we're looking at spatial relationships and socioeconomic analysis. So we expand our analysis to include coastal flood risk due to land cover, to see how land cover relates to social vulnerability to coastal flooding. And what you're able to understand is that when you aggregate this data on a census block, you're able to understand the metrics like percentage impervious or tree canopy and how that relates to median household income. And more importantly, what you're able to correlate is that there's a direct connection between communities with lower vegetation and higher impervious surfaces and those who are most vulnerable. So essentially, it's a double whammy in terms of what's happening. And ultimately here, this is actually the example of Charleston. And it just demonstrates a community, their risk in terms of the relationship there. And, you know, I get asked a lot, what is the value of being able to understand these details? And to me, this is, like I said at the start of the presentation, geospatial data is the foundation for innovation. It's giving us the information we need to prepare for tomorrow. It's giving us the information to deploy the resources that have been granted through, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure law. There are a lot of resources out there in terms of remedying these situations, but we need to deploy them appropriately. And just to give you guys some numbers here that I found to be quite outstanding is there's 42 million people living in areas at risk of coastal flooding. That translates to 275,000 square miles of land of coastal flooding at risk of coastal flooding, over $7.9 trillion of exposed building value, and over $19 billion of exposed agricultural value. So if you're trying to understand why it's important to understand your communities of today to plan for tomorrow, you know, everyone goes back to an ROI. And I think that those numbers in itself present a pretty good picture, or actually pretty bad picture, of why it's important for us to have these understandings. So anyways, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure to host each and every one of you. And likewise, I hope we have some questions that we can go through and address. I'm just opening up the chat now to see if there's anything that's written in here. Or you can go ahead and pull yourself off mute to ask any questions. Nate, I see Clint asked you something. Do you want to reiterate on what that question was in the chat?
Sure. So Clint from Minnesota was just asking about whether we would incorporate elevation data into CCAP features and essentially utilizing some of the 3D HP or 3-depth LiDAR. And I told him that that certainly is possible. In fact, you might want to expand upon some of the products that I know Ecopia produces related to that kind of information, but it's not something that we've developed as part of our standard product line. And I just went on to say that we certainly do make quite a lot of use of that elevation data for things like vegetation heights and in mapping our water bodies and wetland features.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think when you look at elevation and adding in details here, there's another component that really wasn't talked about, especially as it relates to, you know, flood mapping and whatnot, is the concepts of dams and dikes. And that's something that we are working on in terms of the integration. There's a couple of states that we're having conversations with, and it's actually a large initiative here in Canada to be able to integrate the mapping of those products. So, you know, the concept in terms of hydrology data and the value of coordination with land cover is not new. You know, even Nate, you referenced the Washington State example of how they bought up the high-res vectors. They've done their own studies in terms of the value is using that land cover and the impervious surfaces to you know, correlate and check into the elevation derived hydrography, the hydrography data set. So I think it's already happening to a certain extent within individual communities, but I don't know if that'll necessarily ever take place on the federal side. Nate, there's another question for you from Greg Dobson. It's going back to the beginning. Can you remind us of the anticipated time lapse for the CCAP 1 meter products being available with all land coverage categories?
Yeah, I'm gonna be perfectly honest. I cannot. It's going to be completely dependent on the resources that are available for us to stand those products up, and that could be NOAA resources alone, which means it'll take a little bit longer, or as we can put some more of these partnerships in place with other interested states, that'll speed things up pretty significantly. Right now, you know, we released that first phase of product because that was what we had the money to develop and release at the time, and we're working on that second phase. Our goal is to do that by sometime in 2026 so that we can move right into updating those data on that regular cycle. But that's to be determined based on on funding and available resources.
Thanks, Nate. And I just moved to this 3D land cover slide as Clinton also asked to see that. I'll go back to the emails of everyone here shortly. Any questions for our folks in South Carolina and North Carolina? It's a really good opportunity to understand how they kind of pulled these products together. There's other state folks who want to jump in. All right, well, I'm not seeing anything else here. We are pretty much at the top of the hour anyway. So as Emily referenced at the start of the call, this is being recorded and it will be distributed. If you have any further questions for anyone here, everyone's emails are listed. So please feel free to reach out. And yeah, hopefully this is something that can be applied in other states and something that can be continued to scaled as we work on developing these products both on the federal and state side. And lastly, I just want to thank again each of the presenters here for taking the time to put all this information together and to speak with you all today. It was really an engaging discussion and I certainly appreciate it. And thank you, Nijdik, for hosting this.